back to Terry. Well, basically I forced him to stay awake for 5 days and 5 nights. And believe me, I suffered with him. I pushed coffee down his throat. I pushed food down his throat. I was with him constantly. When he went into the bathroom, I would knock on the door to make sure he wasn't asleep in there, make sure he was finished, he would come out. We walked up and down the beach together in the middle of the night when he cried and said he couldn't go on anymore.
So you were basically asleep all the time too, to make sure that he stood asleep?
I did not sleep all that time to make sure that he did not sleep, because I felt for him and I did not want him to go through that punishment. I could not bear to see that punishment inflicted on Terry, so I vowed to stay awake to help him. And I believed I was doing it for his salvation as well as mine, you see. He left soon after. He was a broken man. He never, even though Hubbard recognized that the assignment was done, Terry never smiled again. And he left the Sea Org soon afterwards. I have often wondered why, if we understand that Hubbard is right in everything he does, why didn't Terry come through that okay? If Hubbard knew that Terry, if he assigned it and it was a right thing, Terry should have been okay. So why didn't Terry come through it okay? Why was his will broken? And then I rationalized and I said, well, obviously, it had to be Terry's fault, not Hubbard's fault. And around about the same time, Phoebe Mara, who was another Sea Project member, was assigned the first condition of liability. And she had to wear this dirty jumpsuit and a gray rag and a gray black mark on her cheek, which was the sign of liability. And she was forbidden to talk or mix with anyone. If the cook chose to give her food, then she had to eat it on deck. She had to sleep on deck. She could talk to no one. She could not bathe or wash. One of Hubbard's policies was to put a head on a pike when things were going wrong, put a head on a pike, make an example of a person, and he always found new ways to do it. His shock tactics worked. We were a very compliant crew. Also at the same time, his public relations officer, Yvonne Jensch, at that time her name was Yvonne Gillam, lived with him in his villa, and she told me later on that he made constant sexual advances toward her, and she rejected him at every turn. It did not make him stop, and finally she asked to be assigned somewhere else. And she was the first person. She went ashore to Los Angeles to start the Celebrity Center there. She later on, much later on, developed a brain tumor, came back to the ship, came back to the Fort Harrison Hotel and died there from cancer. By October 67, Hubbard declared the Sea Project a success and formed the Sea Organization. And very quickly after that, I became the captain of the Avon River. I even knew how to take fixes off the sun and the stars and the moon to plot our course with a sextant. We were all trained to do that. In early 1968, Hubbard released OT3, the story about Xenu and the body spirits. And I found it to be a science fiction story and incomprehensible. And I really tried for 15 years to apply those techniques because, why? Not to do so meant that I was bad. I was a suppressive person. I was a degraded being and beyond salvation. Because that's what Hubbard said. And that's when my headaches started. Another friend of mine, Peggy Bankston, became his personal banking officer, and she confided in me that she was having an affair with Hubbard. And I believed her. Peggy had no reason to lie to me. Again, I was shocked. I justified it, I rationalized it, Hubbard knew what he was doing. He had to have his releases. And a short while later, Peggy fell out of favor with him, and he declared her suppressive and sent her off the ship. And I then found that there was a pattern. Every time Hubbard needed a sexual relationship with someone, he would do it, but soon afterward, that person would fall out of favor and would be sent off the ship. It was that time that that little boy, the 4-year-old Derek Green, was put into the chain locker. And I won't go through that story again. I've mentioned it in the earlier interview. That was a dark time. I don't know that we were able to justify why Hubbard thought that was okay. Of course, he said a small child is really a big being in a child's body. He has returned into this life and he knows what he's doing. Then there was the big ship assigned the condition of liability, steaming out of Valencia Harbor with the grey cloth around the funnel and all the crew with the black marks on their cheeks. I will now go into a few things that I have not mentioned in the earlier interview. Shortly after that, Hubbard, when the Royal Scotsman completed her assignment, Hubbard went back on board and sailed down to North Africa, to the port of Melilla in French Morocco. And one night, Amos, my chief officer, called me up to the bridge and he said, "Hubbard, LRH is on the radio and he wants to talk to you." He said he's crying, and Amos was shocked, and I ran up to the bridge, and Hubbard was on the radio and he was crying, and he said, "I beg you, please sail to Melilla immediately. The Royal Scotsman, I have lost control of the ship. I need you here to help." And I found it very hard, of course. I said, "Yes, sir, of course. We will sail. We have a few engine repairs to do. We have a few assignments to finish. Within 2-3 days, we will be there." And by the time we arrived, which was almost, unfortunately, maybe fortunately, a week later, the worst was over. My husband at the time, not Jerry, my first husband, told me that 100 new recruits had come aboard in Melilla. They were all untrained and they had caused havoc. I don't understand why, because you control new people in an organization, but in order to regain control, Hubbard had assigned those 100 people and the officers who were not able to control them into the ship's old water tanks. They were huge tanks, metal tanks, with only a small opening in the top. And there were a number of them. And these people had to go into the tanks to chip out the old paint and the rust in the tanks. And they were in there for up to 84 hours and longer. My husband was one of them who was assigned to one of the tanks. They were not allowed to sleep. When they stopped chipping or nodded off, a guard would hit the tank with a metal bar. And again, there were no toilet. You were not allowed out to go to the toilet. There was no toilet paper. And it seemed to be a form of punishment that Hubbard liked. And I did not think at the time that that was so far over the edge that it was a red alert that was flashing. I didn't see it. I just thought he knew what he was doing.